So thank you all for participating today and for signing up for this webinar, which is a little bit different from from what you might be used to when coming to a narrative webinar. For those of you who don't know us, all of this is new to you. But for those of you who do know us, we have never done a webinar around onboarding and engaging new hires. So I'm going to talk about how we can do that through storytelling and how you can create a more effective way of onboarding people, whether you have an onboarding process already or whether you don't. So to take a step back, my name is Jerome Deroy, and I am the CEO of this company, Narrative, which is a listening and storytelling company. We've been around for more than 20 years. The origin of this company actually started during a public health crisis, not so unlike what we're going through now. And at that time, it was the AIDS crisis. The founder of Narrative, Murray Nossel, is a PhD in social work. And so he was a social worker, and he was working with a group that supported people with HIV and AIDS in 1994. And he was there to help them through their dying days, because at that time, people were dying. And people were so attuned with therapy and all of that sort of jargon that whenever he asked people how they felt, they said, well, how helpful is that to me? What does that mean to me? It doesn't mean anything. Well, how would you feel if you knew you were going to die in a week? So pretty quickly, he came up with another approach. And that approach was to first listen to where people were coming from, what their circumstances were, beyond this label of having AIDS or HIV. And then after listening, he came up with another approach, which was to help facilitate telling stories, so that what they were really afraid of was leaving nothing behind. And so they told stories as a way of leaving something of themselves behind after their death. And it started this way in this group, and little by little, there were more and more people in the group. And they made videotapes of their stories until such time that the government started to threaten cutbacks on programs that Murray was working with, people that Murray was working with. And so as a result of that, what they did is they took their videotapes, their stories, and they left them on the desks of legislators. And they asked the question, listen to my story, watch my story, and tell me I don't deserve the same rights as everybody else. And it's on the basis of these stories that the whole epidemic, the whole public health crisis changed. And it changed mindsets, and it changed the approach, so much so that more money was put into programs like these, more money was put into the research for treatments, and a few years later, the treatments that exist today came out. And so many, so people were able to not only survive, but thrive. So that's the origin of Narrative. And from there, what we've done is we've leveraged this power of storytelling that it has to connect with the genuine side of people, who you really are, and connect that with what you do in an organization. And to us, the proof is this list of clients, which is a sample list of clients over the last 15 years now, where we took this methodology into the corporate world. And we've really applied it to three main areas. One is leadership development, and a good example of that is our work with Prudential, which is up here on your screen, where we work with leaders on articulating their mission, their vision, their values, so that all the stakeholders, not just the customers, but also the employees and internally, people understand what their role is within this larger context through the concrete experiences that these leaders have had. So it's kind of taking the mission and vision and bring it down to the ground through real life stories. That's one aspect of what we do. The other one, the other one is around sales, and this just popped up, Ingo Money. That's a fintech company, where here they came to us because they were seeing that their pitch was kind of falling flat because of the fact that they were starting with their features and solutions. They hadn't taken the time to tell a story about the challenges that they were actually solving. And so that's what we help them do. We help them identify stories around pain points and challenges, and then craft those stories and link those to their solutions. Because if I don't know what you're trying to solve for me, I don't actually care about the solution, right? If you don't let me know very clearly what your challenge is, then you can show me your solution and I can be either indifferent or I can be enthusiastic. but there's no kind of middle ground, and there's no real, I don't really care. So that's what we help them do, and that's what we help in sales in general. And then finally, team building, that's the UNICEF logo that just came up there. UNICEF is a longtime client since 2008, and they keep calling us back to do team building with them because they're such a huge organization, really to help collaborators connect with each other on a deeper level so that they can kind of understand how to communicate with one another. So we kind of look at where the communication breakdowns are occurring, and then how can we use stories to bridge those gaps and to fill those voids. So that's what we've done for now 20 years. And we since then have written a book in the last 3 years. Our co-founder, Murray, who I was talking about earlier, wrote a book a couple of years ago that's been published by McGraw-Hill. McGraw-Hill actually approached us to write a book. And so we did that. And I encourage you to get that book wherever you can. It's available on Amazon. And you, by getting this book, what you'll learn is you'll essentially learn our methodology of listening and storytelling, because each chapter is a step in that method. And now I finally get to what we're going to talk about today and what we're going to focus on. Just as an aside here, everything I've spoken of until now, our website, narrative.com, NARATIV.com, has a blog, and it also has many resources around these three areas: leadership, team building, and sales. So if you want to learn more about that, you can obviously email me and anyone on our team, but you can also go to our website and check out those resources, which are all free. And you'll see in our blog that we've also done webinars around these topics. And actually, our next webinar is going to be around team building. So if that's an area that's interesting to you, please stay tuned and look for those emails. So what we're here to discuss today, the reason I sort of told you the history a little bit, is that we arrived at a conclusion 5-6 years ago now, that a great point of entry for storytelling is with new hires. New hires are fresh, they're eager, they want to learn about your culture, they want to learn about their role, they want to know how best they can do it. And so what are the stories that you can tell those new hires that's going to engage them from the get-go and give them this natural way to gather mission critical information and create that memorable content? And what we found, and what I'm going to show you today, is that it creates deeper engagement and it actually impacts your bottom line. So how I'm going to demonstrate this to you today is we're actually going to go through one of our case studies with a client. I'm going to tell you a few stories. And then by the end of this, we'll also have a Q&A. But again, if you have any thoughts, use the chat box to sort of, to give your thoughts, reflections, and questions. So let me get into a little bit of another topic here that's part of this onboarding and how do we engage new hires, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention the current environment that we're in, where this is not my office, this is my home, right? It has become my office, but it wasn't a choice. And so many of us are now forced to work remotely. And what happens when you work remotely? Many of you have said in the surveys that we sent out before, that when you registered, that working remotely was a challenge to bring people together. And I wrote this article about the value of the water cooler conversation and how we've lost that since we've lost physical spaces to gather in. For me, 21 years ago, I'm going to date myself a little bit, 1999, I was doing an internship as part of my business school program in Paris. And I was at the water cooler and I was actually getting a coffee, and Brigitte came up to me. Brigitte is a veteran of this place that I was working in, which is BNP Paribas. That is a French bank which has offices all over the world. I'd been in this internship for about 2 months. And Brigitte comes up to me. She works in my department, which is a marketing department. And she pulls out a cigarette out of her cigarette pack. She lights it up. This is Paris, 1999. Can't do that anymore, but at the time you still could. And I'm having my coffee, and she says, "Ça va? Comment ça va? Bien?" "Oui, oui, très bien, merci." And then she says, your internship is about to end, isn't it?" And I said, yes. And she said, "Well, what are you going to do?" I'm not sure. I may go back to studying and kind of prolong my studies a little bit after business school even. And she said, "Well, I've seen a lot of people go through this department. I've been at least in 5 or 6 departments in this bank over the years, over the 20 plus years that I've been here. And there's one guy who's now in Hong Kong, and he's about to leave his post in Hong Kong, And I know for a fact they're going to soon publicize the fact that they need somebody to replace him. And because he did the same internship as you, he's been on this team, I think you should give him a call and find out what the situation is and whether you could maybe get that job. And I called the guy, and she said, and make sure that you say that Brigitte told you to call him. And so I did. 3 months later, I was in Hong Kong starting a job when I was 26 years old. And I stayed there for about 4 years. That conversation, that opportunity would have never happened if we had not had this sort of informal place where we could gather and tell each other these kinds of stories and have these conversations. The other kinds of things that Brigitte was talking about, and many people were talking about around the water cooler, were challenges they were having at work, challenges they were having in their personal lives. They were getting more personal. They were connecting with one another. Successes that they'd had, again, in their career, in their life. Complaints that they had about leadership, about the culture. Everything was told around the water cooler. The people we didn't see around the water cooler were the leaders of the company, the managers of these different teams, right? So these stories were completely lost on them. And as a result, many people left. I was one of them. I actually left because I wasn't so engaged, and no one really acknowledged what was going on with me. What were my desires? What did I want? What were my challenges at work? The only place we had to talk about that was the water cooler. So what happens now that the water cooler is gone, right? We need a system to capture these experiences, the richness of all that critical information that's happening here. And to us, this is what motivated us to create storytelling for onboarding, because stories live all over your organization, as you can see on this slide here. And what do they communicate? Stories communicate mission and vision. They communicate your role. What is your role about? They make it much clearer when you hear a story from someone else who was in your shoes, like I did with Philippe. Philippe is the guy that I replaced in Hong Kong. He told me stories of his experience working in that place before he left. That gave me a huge amount of knowledge, right? It made my role much clearer to me. And it also made much clearer what my role was in relationship to other people. So it builds relationships as well. Culture, values. We see this in organizations. When we go into a physical space, you see the values on a wall, right? Or worse, I've had clients who've told me, well, you want to know about our values? And they pull out a drawer, and there's a deck in that drawer, the PowerPoint with their branding and all their colors and their values, et cetera. And the guy told me it's been in my desk drawer for about a year, right? It's not brought to life. Stories bring to life your culture and values. And if you don't take control of that narrative, if you're not shaping that narrative yourselves, people will tell stories, whether it's around the water cooler or now in informal Zoom meetings, about your culture and values. That's probably not the story that you want to tell about your culture and values, because they just don't know what it is. And finally, that leads us to engagement and belonging, right? So when I tell you a story, you start to think about stories that happen to you. Stories beget stories, right? We're hardwired for stories. This is one of the principles that we have and that you can read about in our book. We're hardwired for stories, which means that our brains are uniquely capable of actually making connections, right? When we're told a story. So when we listen to a story and when we tell a story, our brains are engaging in a completely different way, so much so that we remember stories more than anything else, right? And so that engages us. And when I hear stories that are about, what I can do in this organization, what the mission is, what the vision is, and if I can place myself in that narrative, then I feel like I'm part of it, right? That's how we create this sense of belonging. So this is the opportunity that you all have, is to create such a system within your organization. And at the center of that system is the new hire, right? Now, again, why the new hire? Why story? Why now for a new hire? That's a question we always ask all of our clients. The first step is why story, why now? So why story, why now for a new hire? Because again, that's the best person that's the person that's the most open to hearing the stories that you have about your organization, because they need that information, right? This is knowledge that's critical to them for doing a good job, for getting them quicker to productivity, and for understanding the culture and values so that they see themselves in it and they can see themselves live by these values that you have. So in a moment, I'm going to tell you about a particular client, and we're going to go through that story. I just want to sum up some of the key features of the process that we take our clients through, and you'll see this demonstrated. So it may seem a little bit, a little bit theoretical or abstract now, but it's going to become more concrete. What we see this as is an opportunity to systematize anything that's been informal, right? So right now, what we're doing, because we're all remote, we're actually formalizing Zoom meetings. How do you listen on a Zoom meeting? How do you tell a story? When is the most appropriate time to tell a story? What is it for? Why are you telling a story? So we're creating this ecosystem even in a remote setting, right? So that it creates something that's much more coherent. It enhances or reshapes an existing onboarding program. So again, I think we'll see this in the stats, but around 30% of you said you didn't have a formal onboarding program. So you're in a great place now, because this should give you a lot of food for thought. But for those of you who do have an onboarding program, this is a way to look at it slightly differently and to make sure that you're engaging people on every level. You can show the diversity of your employees and really the true representation of your organization. We have many clients that do this for that purpose, right? They really want to show what they're about. And so they find people within the organization that represent what they're doing, right? And so you can identify that. And then finally, it leaps over this virtual divide, right? So that water cooler, those conversations that we've lost, you can recreate that in a better way, right? You can direct those conversations in a more formal way, so that you're actually capturing those experiences and that knowledge, right? And we're using what I was talking about earlier, this brain's natural hardwiring for stories, right? So that people remember these stories, whether we're on Zoom or anywhere else, it doesn't matter. Those stories, they still land. So what did you say? How does this mirror what you said? So when you registered, we asked a couple of questions, and these are the themes that we found across the board, right? And I actually have a couple. I'll read you a couple of these quotes that I thought were interesting here. So the biggest one that we found actually is that there's either an inefficient or there's just no formal process at all, right? That's 31% there. Then after that, 26% is sharing cultures and values, right? That's the challenge you're having right now, is about sharing culture and values. After that, we're talking about 20% of you saying that the challenge is remote onboarding. Many of you talked about that, 1/5. 17% talked about increasing engagement, right? And finally, 6% even talked about recruitment. On recruitment, it's interesting. Someone said how to present or sell what we do and how we do it in order for potential new colleagues to want to join us, even if we're a small business, right? So this can be a great, once you start with this onboarding program, of course it's internal, but then you'll find, and we've found this with our clients, that our clients use these stories for external purposes, one of which is recruitment. So all of these actually really mirror what we do with our clients and the kinds of things that people come to us for. The answer to the question, why story, why now, is often around these topics right here. Just a couple more here that I thought were interesting to highlight in terms of increasing engagement. Older team members have experienced the story and they've made it their own, but new team members are transient in commitment, right? So again, it's going back to what I was saying, this is the opportunity to engage people at the outset from their very first day and put them on this, align everyone, basically, whether you've been there for 20 years and know the story really well and are really kind of steeped into it, or whether you've just been there for a day and now you're actually absorbing all those stories, you're listening to those stories. Remote onboarding, challenges with remote employees feeling like a part of the company. How do you create that sense of belonging? That's part and parcel of what we do. Sharing culture and values. COVID-19 and virtual onboarding has made acculturation difficult, right? So integrating people into the culture is that much more difficult because we no longer have a space to congregate in. And then of course, no process. So you'll hear now how not having a process actually brought out ideas and innovations for this client that I'm about to talk about. Relevant statistics. 69% of employees are more likely to stay with a company for 3 years if they experienced great onboarding, right? So that tells you something about reducing your turnover, retaining people, which I know is a big issue for a lot of companies. Typically takes 8 months for a newly hired employee to reach full productivity. In the case study that I'm going to present to you, they brought down their learning curve from 6 months where people were shadowing others to 6 weeks by doing this program, right? 35% of companies have no formal onboarding program. Kind of interesting, again, mirroring what 31% of you have said. You're in good company, you're not alone. And the good news is that you're on this webinar. So you can learn a lot about how to put this in place. So now I'm going to come to the client that I want to tell you about to make all of this kind of concrete, and you can learn more about the process of what it takes to actually bring people into such a program and the kinds of results you can get. So Measures for Justice is a longtime client. We started working with them in 2011 when it was just 1 or 2 people in the company. And I helped, Amy Bach is her name, she's the CEO of the company. I helped her with her pitch to tell the story of what her company was about. And based on that pitch, she raised $3.1 million in one meeting and attained all her fundraising goals. And since then, they've been growing and growing and growing. And then one day, oh, and I should tell you what Measures for Justice is. What they do is they are a research agency, and they collect data from all counties in all of the US. So I think there's something like 3,000 counties. So they go all over the US, and the data that they're collecting is the data that prosecutors, sheriffs, judges, courts, the whole criminal justice system. They look at all of the criminal justice system. There's no system of checks and balances in the criminal justice system in the US. Each county does whatever it wants, basically. And so they've created this company as a way to create the system of checks and balances. So a big part of their job is they have these data outreach managers and people who go out to get the data from often very reluctant people who don't necessarily think that they'll benefit from transparency, from being more transparent. So that's what Measures for Justice is, and that's kind of what their challenge has been, is connecting with their audience and the stakeholders that they work with in such a way that they are trusted by them, and that these stakeholders will hand over their information, and that they can see the benefit for them of doing that. So I was introduced to the director of outreach, who's now moved on to another organization. Her name is Caroline Nobo-Sarnoff. And this is what she asked. She asked, how can we help new hires understand what their job is going to look like from their very first day? So she had a system where people, when they were smaller, when the organization was smaller, people would shadow her for many months. And then at the end of 6, 7 months, they would be ready to do this job on their own, right? She couldn't do that anymore because they were growing so fast. And so she was looking for a system to create. And I'm going to let Caroline speak for herself. This is a video I'm going to share right now. Make sure that this works. And this is a video of me and Caroline where I was interviewing her about the process. And here she is talking about this.
No one is prepared for this role because it doesn't really exist anywhere else. And, you know, the challenge was like, how do you train someone for something they've never done without them actually going and doing it? And, you know, the way we were doing it was sort of like, okay, you're just like thrown into the fire from the very beginning. And I wanted a way for people to understand what it meant to be part of the data outreach team without having to go out there, which is why these stories were so important, right? So from the very beginning, they could start to envision, like, this is what a day at my job is going to look and feel like. And that's really important when you have a job that someone can't always visualize. And, you know, part of you helping me mine those stories, I think for me, I didn't realize there were themes. Right. So I was just sort of going through the motions, right? I'm having meetings every day, and I wasn't able to sort of zoom out and realize that there are themes through these meetings and typical scenarios that I could be passing on fairly easily to new people on the team, right? Like, I'm thinking, oh, they just have to learn it by sitting through these meetings, but actually there were some pretty clear themes that you helped establish. And then we were able to create this training structure that is a series of stories based on those different scenarios. And that was very useful. No one is perfect.
Okay, so just a couple of things to flag here in what Caroline said, which really sort of struck me a lot. And I wonder if you can relate to this. When she says no one is prepared for this role because there is no other role like this one. I think everyone seems to think that whatever they do in the world is completely unique to them, and there's nothing that anyone else can relate to. So that was sort of the first hurdle that we had to get through, was this notion, this perception that Caroline had, that this was so unique that it was actually kind of impossible to transfer this knowledge that she had to other people. And that, you know, we needed something really unique, or a unique approach, right? And that's why she came to us ultimately. And I'll say a little bit more about this. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about is that she also said that it helped to zoom out, right? The process helped her to zoom out and refine and find themes that she herself hadn't even thought about. This is a huge part of our methodology, the narrative listening and storytelling methodology. The reason we call it a listening methodology first and foremost is because that's part of the process when we work with people. So we listened to Caroline first. We listened to what her challenges were. We listened to what her definition of this role was. And we listened to her experiences, and we asked questions that started to excavate some of these stories, and themes started to emerge that she herself wasn't able to see. And we got a series of scenarios. We were able to extrapolate 5 situations that new hires are most likely to encounter in the field based on Caroline's rich experiences. And then what we did after that, once we had these 5 situations, 5 scenarios, we coached Caroline. And again, this is using the narrative storytelling methodology now, moving from listening to storytelling. And what we're asking her to do when we craft these stories is to tell us what happened, give us the rich details of her experience, and even make it sensory, right? So I remember she told us a story about a sheriff that rejected her just almost from the get-go. And she said that in his office, he had a big kind of fish above his desk. That was a stuffed fish, obviously, and it was like a big marlin or something. And so she described this, and then she described the lapel on his shirt, and it was sort of a symbol that she didn't know, but then he explained to her that it was a hunting group and a fishing group that he belonged to. And then she also said in that story that at some point she stopped talking and she just listened to what he had to say. And he revealed something to her. He revealed something to her that was really challenging his office at the moment. And what came out of that is that he started to see the benefit of this data that Caroline was trying to collect from him for himself, because she heard him say something that could benefit him, right? That she knew would benefit him. So the moment she stopped listening, so she told us all this story, right? She told us this whole story, and then we helped her craft that story with our what happened method. That's our first bullet point. And then we let the story speak for itself, right? So we had 5 stories by the end of this first go in this process that were really linked to real themes, real world situations that new hires are likely to go through. And then we connected these stories to the roles that people would have, and finally to the team as a whole. Like, how does this help advance the mission and vision of Measures for Justice? You need to be able to see yourself as part of the whole in order to be motivated to do your job and kind of see where is this going to land, right? So what it looked like as a deliverable was what you're seeing on your screen. This is a screenshot of a platform that we created. First year we did this was in the form of a podcast. So you would actually hear Caroline's voice in your earbuds. You would hear her tell your story, and then you would hear a summary of it along with lessons, which we put onto a platform. And then the second year we did this, we then added video. And who you're seeing here is actually someone who was a new hire the first time we did this as a podcast. When we did it the second time with video, we invited her, Jenny, to come onto the program and tell her stories of what she had encountered in the field, so that it became actually a much richer program. Instead of hearing one voice now, we were hearing multiple voices. We added 2 voices to the program, right? And now we're talking about more voices as they're growing, right? So this is an evolving kind of system that we've created for them, where once you've got the bare bones of it and you know the methodology, you can keep adding stories as your company changes and grows, even maybe as your mission, vision, and values themselves may get tweaked or refined. This is what we did there too. Their messaging changed. And so we added a whole a whole new section here. You see on the left-hand side where I'm putting my my cursor, you can see that there are sections to this. And so we had a number of different sections, and this just grew and grew, and then people went through this, and they learned through the stories. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about, I could tell you a little bit about the impact, but I'm going to play you another video where you'll see Caroline and Jenny this time talking about this.
Start a new job, especially at a research organization, they're thinking, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to read the methodology, but I'm not going to hear stories about how this organization is affecting people in the real world every day. Training is always boring, and it's always staged, and it always seems just very fake. For the first time, it was. I knew these stories were real, and they just felt like they were resonating with me in a way that training hadn't before. The reason this training is really important for me as a leader is that I used to, when we hired new members of the data outreach team, I would just have them come shadow me. And then they would sort of over time evolve into doing that work on their own. But right now, it's just not realistic that every data outreach member gets to shadow me. I was excited to hear more, and I felt the stories that were being told were going to be helpful even prior to going out and getting the experience out in the field. So this way they can hear about my experiences, how it shaped the role of a data outreach team member. And then once they go on the road, they have some of my knowledge in their brain.
Okay, so some of my knowledge in their brain. I think by now you may have, I know that many of you are practitioners, chief people officers, HR, etc. And we talk a lot about in this field about knowledge transfer. And that's really what this is about. It's taking these experiences that Caroline had and extracting them literally from her brain, from her own experience. And the methodology here is to put these experiences into stories that other people can actually understand, connect with, and most importantly, that are actionable, right? If you don't know what to do with a story, then it's not having the impact that we want it to have. We're really looking for stories and experiences that relate to these new hires. That was the bulk of our work with Caroline before she got to tell her stories and crafted her stories, was really finding what those stories were. What are those experiences that are most relatable to people? So some of the outcomes that I've alluded to earlier, reduced a steep learning curve from 6 months to 6 weeks, reduced the cost, because think about all the cost of travel and having to shadow someone and just be with her for so many months, increased the retention of content that was related to their role. They used to have a very dense kind of binder that people would have to go through about all this information. There was really, a lot of it was related to compliance as well. And they had to kind of, sort out what compliance was from what my role is, from what the culture is, and then they're meeting all these people. And as a result, they're not retaining a lot of information. And it ends up that they're having to learn everything on the job, right? Here with stories, because of the quality of stories, that stories have to make information much more memorable. And again, our natural ability of connecting with stories, people retained information. One great example that I have is Jenny, who you saw in that last video, telling us that a year after she went through the program and heard Caroline's stories, she was in a meeting with a sheriff, very similar situation. It was very challenging. And she remembered something that Caroline said in her story, which was about how she actually overcame that challenging situation. And she used it. She used that story, she used the lesson, and she got out of it. She got out of it on the other side. Had she not heard that story, had she not gone through that program, she told us that she would have never been able to get through to the other side and convince this person to give them their data. The candor of the stories builds transparency and trust, right? One really interesting thing that happened that Caroline told us that she didn't say in this video is the relationships that this started to build, that this started to create within the organization at Measures for Justice. She had noticed that people were a little bit shy to come up to her because they kind of saw her as this superstar who'd been there for 10 years. And so they were very intimidated by her. And she kind of literally did this whole outreach program on her own for a few years. And so they thought that she had all the answers, and that, if they went up to her to say that they had screwed up on something or made a mistake, that, she wouldn't really understand, that she wouldn't have any patience for it. But the beauty of this is that she told stories when she herself was rejected, when she actually failed and didn't get to a positive result. And we really wanted those stories in the program because it humanized her and it made her vulnerable as a leader. And what happened is that she had conversations with people every time people went through this program. She would debrief with them. And many more people came up to her to say, you know, now I see you as a human being, not just this superstar. And she noticed that many more people came up to her to share what their challenges were. So that in turn, she's giving information to people through her stories, but now she's hearing stories from people thanks to that, right? And she's hearing critical information through those stories that people are giving her. So it created this atmosphere of transparency and trust that ultimately affected the entire organization and their bottom line. Higher engagement, training satisfaction. You heard Jenny. I know that many people are practitioners in the HR world here. Please don't take it personally when we say that, when she says that training is usually boring and not engaging. I don't believe that all training is boring and engaging. I myself am a facilitator of trainings. So you know, but the point that we're making here is that you have an opportunity to make it much more engaging. When I started in that bank in Hong Kong, the first thing they did is they gave me 2 big binders, and they gave me 48 hours to go through these big binders on my own in an office that didn't have any windows. And that's all I did for 48 hours, go through 2 binders. And then I watched some videos from the 1980s that were supposed to tell me about my role. So it's only when I started to meet people and when I started to do the job that I really got a sense of what the job was, right? So if this resonates at all with you, you know, please take this into consideration because you really have the opportunity to engage people on a much deeper level here. And it doesn't take much to do that, right? We developed themes for future training programs. Now, this was interesting because earlier I said that, you know, the process revealed themes to Caroline that she wasn't herself aware of, right? And it made it a lot more relatable. And we used 5 of those themes for this program. But then other themes came up, and those became a priority for future programs, right? For other areas of the organization. So really what's going on here is we have a story cycle that's happening. That's what I'm talking about here. And you could really equate this to a knowledge transfer cycle. In our parlance, how we talk about this is that it begins with listening. And the listening is part of finding the stories that fit your objective, right? Then we listen to what happened. We help you craft the stories through interviews and coaching, as I described earlier. And then we actually hear the stories. We tell the stories. We develop them. We record them. We capture that knowledge now through these stories. And then we put them onto a platform that connects with your audience. That's how your audience is going to connect with this, either through your LMS, through a story library, website, whatever is the best fit for that audience. And then we ask the question, once we've done that first round, why story, why now, at this moment? You've done the program once. What are the new stories? What do we now need, right? So we're talking about the integration of stories and new storytellers. That's how we found Jenny in our second iteration of that program, right? Because we knew we needed other voices. And by asking that question, even though we'd done it 2 years earlier, we could have done the exact same thing with Caroline, find other stories or make them a little bit more refined or tweak them. No, we asked the question again, why are we doing this and why now? And they communicated to us a whole new urgency, right? At the beginning, it was about we're growing really fast. Now it was about going to other states and creating a consistent message. So when we worked that first program, Measures for Justice was in 5 states. Then they were in many more states after that. And they saw this lack of consistency in their messaging. So we made that part of the new program. That was their why story, why now? And that's how we found Jenny. And that's how we involved Amy Bach, the CEO, to actually be part of the program as well, right? So this is a whole cycle that you can now start to think about for yourselves. And why would you do this? What are the differentiators? At the very beginning, the title of this webinar is Beyond Compliance. So you're all interested in going beyond compliance and engaging these hires. Many people talk about employee engagement. There's a crisis of engagement, actually. The statistics show us that most people are not engaged at work, right? This is what we're talking about here, but how do we do this? And so to us, what's different about this approach is that it replaces costly, time-consuming workshops, right? We think about engagement as, okay, well, let's do a workshop over here on this topic or that topic, and that'll get people more engaged. It works for a time, but then it dwindles, right? Here we're talking about a system that makes this much more evergreen and kind of not just evergreen, but it actually evolves, right? We're transforming presentations that are data heavy into relatable, memorable story content, right? Recruitment, we talked about that at the top of the presentation here. One of our clients is talking about doing this so that they can give a real picture of what it's like to work here. So they actually now have a video on their website that shows that are videos that were taken from the onboarding program that we created for them, right? Building relationships virtually by getting to know others in your organization through roles and behaviors. It's a real challenge, as many of you have talked about, to be able to connect with one another. We feel pretty isolated, right? So how do we get across that sense of isolation? If I can hear stories about my colleagues in a less formal way, but that are still linked to a particular topic, particular value that you have, something that your culture really represents, then I'm going to understand you and the culture of your organization and what you stand for. Not only am I just going to understand you, but I'm actually going to connect with you in a much deeper way and more meaningful way, right? So these are the differentiators of the program. Of course, there might be others as you go along with a program like this that you'll find, because everything we do is customized. But this is really what strikes us about this and what people get from it. So now it's over to you. And just taking a beat here, I've talked a lot and I've presented you with a lot of material, right? So you may be asking yourselves, well, how do I do this myself, right? So now I'm inviting you to ask yourselves a few questions. What are the stories that need to be told? Just think about that for just a second right now. What are the stories that need to be told that contain that critical information so that if I'm a new hire, I walk into your organization, this is what I need to hear? That's the first question. Why now? Why do you need to tell stories now? What do you need to tell that story at this moment? Create a sense of urgency for yourself, right? A lot of people talk about onboarding as something you've got to do, right? It's just something we have to do. It's compliance, etc. We're going beyond compliance here. We're talking about something that engages people from the get-go. It's a unique opportunity that you have to do that, right? It goes away after that first month. People start to disengage right after that first month, right? So now you've got that unique opportunity. So what are the stories that need to be told? Why now? Who are the storytellers in your organizations who've got the stories that can bring to life your culture, the values, right? All that critical information that new hires need so that they can understand their role for themselves and in relationship to others, right? So this is just to get you started. Obviously, we're here to support you. So I want to also thank everyone who has participated here. Thanks, Deirdre, for your thanks. You're very welcome for sharing all this information. And I really look forward to learning more about your own circumstances and how we can help you effectively create a story library for your organizations, really something that really holds all of this unique knowledge that your people hold in your organizations and how you can leverage that through storytelling. So we're always available for that. Thanks again, everyone.